We are looking at the little book of Jude, and there is a great deal said in this book about love, and so we want to consider that this morning. We want to notice 4 points relative to love. We want to begin by noticing love multiplied. If you'll take a look at the second verse, Jude says, "Mercy unto you and peace and love be multiplied." Love be multiplied. Now we know that Jude wanted to write them a letter about the common salvation, and no doubt that letter would have had much to say about love, because that is what we share in common. We share a common love, a common faith, a common bond. And so no doubt that's what Jude had in mind. He's not able to write that letter because there's one that's more needful, but he does wish that their love might be multiplied. As we think about individuals and relationships, we think about the love that they have when perhaps a husband and wife, when they first see one another, and when they meet and when they get to know one another, and we see that love grow and blossom. And yet, that love, even though it may be so strong and may be so fervent at that moment, is not what it's going to be. Because it has not spent the time together to be deeper. It's a surface type of love, perhaps at that time, but it will grow deeper and stronger over the years until which the bond, the separation of that bond will be almost impossible. As we think about that, the same is true of brothers and sisters in Christ. It takes time to get to know one another. It takes time to love one another in a deep and full way. We may love one another in a surface way as we come to know one another, but as we grow to know more and more about one another, and as we grow to share more and more in one another's lives, when we're there for weddings, and we're there for deaths, and we're there through sickness, and we're there through all of the things that happen in life, then that love grows. It multiplies. At least it's supposed to. And if it doesn't multiply, then chances are it's not going to survive. It's not going to weather the storms of life. And Jude knew that these brethren were about to go through a horrible storm, because there were individuals that had crept in among them, and there were individuals that were perverting the grace of God. And he knew that if their love was not strong, if their bond was not strong, that they would not weather this. And so he is wishing and praying that their love might be multiplied. Now, this is a common expression in the New Testament. You may take a look at a few other places. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 9 is an example of this. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 9. "And this I pray, that your love may abound, yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment." Now, this statement was written to probably one of the closest congregations recorded in the New Testament. You would struggle to find a congregation that was more united. You'd struggle to find a congregation that was more what it needed to be than what the church at Philippi was. It was not perfect. He's going to address even some division between two sisters in chapter 4. And there are some problems that exist at Philippi. But by and large, this congregation is what it needs to be. And so their love was already great. Their love was already strong. And Paul will talk about how much that they have loved him. But here his prayer is that their love might abound yet more and more. And it's going to do that through knowledge, he says, and in all judgment. Now, that knowledge is going to come through a study of God's Word, but it's also knowledge that's going to come from the time that they spend one with another and through the struggles that they're in together. That love's going to abound. It's going to grow more and more. The idea of abounding is literally that it will overflow. That love will grow to a point to where it cannot be contained. Now, as we think about this love, and we think about this love abounding and growing, it is wrong for us to ever assume that our love has reached its capacity, that our love has reached all that it can be. Our love can grow as long as we're here on this earth. The love that husbands and wives have for one another can grow day by day. It can grow year by year until it's greater and greater and greater, and there's no age at which it ceases to grow anymore. It changes, it evolves, but it continues to grow. And that's true of brethren as well. And that's the beauty of brethren who, because of circumstances in their lives and other things, are able to spend years together in one congregation. And the strength that can be drawn from that, the love that can be multiplied in that. And that's one of the things that I think that we're losing a little bit in modern society, is that individuals move so much more than they used to move. It was very common at one time for individuals to grow up in a community and pretty much remain in that community all of their lives. And so they knew all of their neighbors and they knew all of the people in the town, but they also, in a congregational sense, knew the same brethren for year after year after year. And there's a benefit and a blessing to that. But now, that often doesn't happen. Often, individuals will be in one congregation 5 or 10 years, and then they'll be in another congregation 5 or 10 years, and that cycle kind of repeats itself to where they get the opportunity of meeting brethren in a number of places and locations, and there is a benefit that comes from that, because sometimes we get such a local view of the church that we don't see the whole. We just see one congregation, and if the congregation that you're in is a troubled congregation, then you kind of begin to see that that's the way the church is everywhere, and that's not the way the church is everywhere. I remember one of the congregations that I preached for a couple of years was a very troubled congregation. Had a number of problems that went back for a number of years. And we converted some people and we restored some people, but it was almost to the point that when you brought them in, you realize that this is going to be what they think of the church. This is going to be how they're going to see the church. And you really didn't want them to get that picture of the church, because we knew that the church was bigger than that. We knew that the church in other places was stronger than that. We knew that the church in other places was more loving than that. And it was sad to see that if they did not venture out beyond that they might never really know the nature of the church. And those of you who have had the benefit of being a member of more than one congregation know differences that can exist in congregation. And perhaps you've found congregations that excelled in certain areas. And so you have an example to use when you think about a congregation that's evangelistic, or you think about a congregation that is loving in a brotherly sense, or you find a congregation that is very concerned with sound doctrine. You begin to see individuals that excel in those areas. And the church at Philippi certainly excelled in many areas. But he was praying that their love might abound even more and more. And he was convinced that would come through knowledge. Now notice 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 12, another statement that deals with this love growing and multiplying. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 12. And the Lord make you to increase and abound in love one toward another, and toward all men, even as we do toward you. Now here is a prayer again, that the Lord would make them to abound. If our love's going to grow, who's going to be the catalyst for that? Well, the Lord's going to have to be the catalyst for that. If we're going to grow in these areas, it's going to have to be with His help. It's going to have to be with His teaching. And so he's asking the Lord to help them to increase and to abound and love one to another, but not just in that way. It starts there, and notice that he begins there, but then he says, toward all men, even as we do toward you. Now, for love to grow, it has to begin with our love for the Lord. As our love for the Lord grows, then a byproduct of that is that the love that we have for one another will grow. And as our love for one another grows, it will begin to spread beyond there to a love for all men in general. But it begins very small with our individual love for the Lord, and then because we love the Lord, then we love those that the Lord loves. We love those that also love the Lord, and so our love for our brethren grows. And then beyond that, our love for all men grows, because we understand that He cares not only about us, but that He cares for all men and wants all men to be saved. Now notice 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 3. as we continue this development of this idea, it's pretty common for this to be expressed. We are bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as it is meet, because that your faith groweth exceedingly, and the charity of every one of you all toward each other aboundeth. Now he was thanking them because their love was growing. Their love was abounding. Their love had not stopped, but it was continuing to grow. It was increasing, and he was able to witness that, and he was thankful for it. 1 Peter 4 and verse 8, a passage that talks about this type of growing love. It doesn't use words that suggest growing, but it does use a word that suggests that the intensity of their love had not decreased. That the intensity of their love was what it had been at the beginning. It was continuing to burn. Notice in verse 8 it says, "And above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins." Fervent charity is literally zealous charity. It's a charity that is full of zeal. Sometimes we see individuals who may remain married in the sense that they stay together, they don't divorce, they don't separate, they stay together, but that love isn't fervent anymore. It isn't as zealous as it ought to be. And it's a good thing that they stay together. It's a good thing that they don't separate. Certainly there is something honorable in that, and yet love is supposed to be more than that. Love is supposed to be filled with zeal, filled with enthusiasm. It's to be a fervent type of thing. And that's true of love for our brethren. It may be true as well that a congregation may not split, they may not suffer division, and yet they still may not be what God would have them to be. They stay together, and there's something honorable about staying together, but their love isn't fervent. Their love isn't continuing to grow and to thrive as God wants it to be. So those are a number of passages that talk about love multiplied. But the second thing we want to consider, going back to Jude, is love manifested. He wanted their love to grow, but now he wants their love to be seen. He wants it to be made known. And there are a number of ways it's going to be made known. It's going to be made known in word by what they say, but it's also going to be made known by deed, by what they do. And love has to be manifested in both ways. It has to be made known in word as well as in deed. Now let's talk about, first of all, how Jude is going to make his love known. If he's asking them to do it, then he must also do it. He must pattern that, model that for them, and so he does. And he begins in verse 3, he says, "Beloved." Now the words that you call another person can manifest love, or they can manifest the opposite of love. Now, here's Jude. Jude wants their love to increase. He wants to promote love among them, and so notice the way that he refers to them, beloved. He's going to do the same thing if you go over to verse 17, but beloved. He's going to do the same thing in verse 20, but ye beloved. Do you have a pet name, or maybe pet names, that you use for the person that you love? Not necessarily calling them by name, but you have a name for them. And it's a name of affection. It's a name of love. And when you call them by that name. Now sometimes strangers call us by those names. Sometimes you'll go out to eat at a restaurant and the waitress will come up and she'll call you by one of those names. And you don't know her from anybody and she doesn't know you from anybody. But she may have a purpose in that. She may be wanting a bigger tip, or may in some other way want something in return for that. But we understand in a loving relationship that the way that we refer to another person certainly can express that love. It has to be followed up with deeds. It wouldn't be enough to call someone a pet name and then not follow that up with deeds. That would be rather hypocritical and rather empty. But Jude calls them beloved 3 times in this short epistle, and so there's no doubt that they know that he loves them. And some of the things that he writes are things that are correcting in nature, and he needs to remind them periodically throughout this epistle that he loves them, and so he does. And so it's manifested in word. But it's also manifested by what he does. Notice in verse 3, "Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and to exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints." Now let's look at it this way. If someone takes the time to sit down and write a letter to you, wouldn't that express love? If they send you a card on your birthday, if they take the time to send you a postcard when they're traveling, if they take the time to write out a letter and send you a letter, just letting you know that they're thinking about you and wanting to know how things are with you, we would say that expresses love. And it's a lost art today. It's a lost art today because we send text today. And texts aren't generally printed out or preserved. And so it's expressed, but it's not saved down through the years. It's not wrapped up and put in a box to be handed down to children and grandchildren one day. And so we're losing something as a result of that. But if somebody did that, you would say that expresses love. And so Jude could have written a letter to them about the common salvation, and they would have said, Jude loves us. He's thinking about us. He's written this to us. Even that letter would have expressed love. But a letter on the common salvation, in comparison to a letter about the threat that was evident against them, which letter, when they're both put side by side, would have to be deemed to be more loving? A letter that's kind of general in nature, or a letter that's specific in nature? A letter that just addresses some of the things they have in common, or a letter that addresses something that threatens their very existence? We'd have to say this letter takes precedent over the other. If you realize that, and if you were watching, you knew that someone you loved was inside of a house, and you were able to see someone breaking into that house, and so you get your telephone and you call them, what's the most loving thing you can do for them? Just simply talk about, how'd your day go? That in any other day, that would be a call that would be loving and a call that would be welcomed. But at a time like that, the call that needs to be made is far more specific than that. It's far more direct than that. It takes on a different tone, a different nature as a result of that. Now, if it's the case that you're watching this and they're in the house and you see someone breaking into that house and you call them, but you don't address that matter, what does that say? Do you really love them? You really don't love them. If you see something that's threatening them and you don't call attention to it, then you don't really love them. And so Jude sees a problem developing among these brethren. He has a letter in mind, a letter that he wants to write. This isn't a letter that he wants to write. This is a letter that he has to write. But when pressed by these two situations, the most loving thing, and if he's going to manifest his love to them, the very first way that he can do that is by writing a letter that addresses the problem that they're facing. And the same is true in preaching, right? You preach a sermon on love, or preach a sermon on danger or threat that's coming in among the brethren. We have a responsibility of doing both, but there are times when the one trumps the other. And when one requires expresses a greater amount of love than what the other does. And that certainly is the case right here, that Jude is addressing this problem because he loves them. He's concerned about them. He doesn't want anything to happen to them. He doesn't want someone to come in and take away their crown. He doesn't want them to suffer spiritual death as a result of this false teaching. And so we see this love manifested by Jude. Go back to the book of Ezekiel and take a look at Ezekiel chapter 3. And you'll see that God in that book was talking to Ezekiel, and he was describing Ezekiel, as he did other prophets, as watchmen, as those that are looking out for His people, and they have certain responsibilities in looking out for His people. And Ezekiel has these responsibilities, and if he's going to love God as he should, and he's going to love them as he should, then he has to do this. Notice in verse 17, beginning of Ezekiel 3, it says, Son of man, I have made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. That's what Jude's doing. It says in verse 18, When I say unto the wicked, Thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. If you don't do your job, if you don't express the warning that I've given to you, then I'm going to hold you accountable. Verse 19, Yet if thou warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. And there are times when warning must be delivered. We must deliver it because God has told us to deliver it. Because we love God, we do what He asks us to do. Because we love others, we deliver that message because it's for their good. In verse 20, again, when a righteous man doth turn from his righteousness and commit iniquity, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die. Because thou hast not given him warning, he shall die in his sin, and in his righteousness which he hath done shall not be remembered. But his blood will I require at thine hand. I want you to think about an Old Testament situation that illustrates this. David has committed adultery with Bathsheba. Nathan is David's friend. God sends Nathan with a message for David. And that message is, you have committed this sin, and I know about it. And something needs to be done about it. Nathan has to go and deliver that message. Now, Nathan manifested his love toward David, number one, by delivering the message. Number two, by the way that he delivered that message. I suppose this message could have been delivered in more than one way. Nathan could have been very direct in simply walking in and saying, David, you've committed adultery. But he doesn't do that. He tells David a story. He begins to evoke certain emotions in David, and then when those emotions are evoked in David, then he brings the point around to David. But he does all of that in love because he loves him. This is how he manifested his love for David. Would Nathan have truly been David's friend if Nathan had known about this problem in David's life and not said anything? If he had simply ignored it and said, we're good friends and I don't want to mess up our friendship and I don't want to cause, David to be angry with me, and so I'm just not going to address this. No, love demanded that it be addressed. If he was going to manifest his love for David, then he was going to have to manifest it in that way. Go to Acts chapter 20 and verse 31, and you'll see that Paul had to do this as well. Acts chapter 20 and verse 31. He's going to tell us the connection is, he tells us that he's free from the blood of all men, because he's not shunned to declare the whole counsel of God. That's in verse 27. And then in verse 31 he says, Therefore watch and remember that by the space of 3 years I cease not to warn everyone night and day. I'm God's watchman. My hands are clean. My hands are clean because I've given the warning that God's asked me to give. I've given that warning day and night. I've done it with tears because I love you and because I'm concerned about you, and I'm manifesting my love through giving this warning. In 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 14. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 14. I write not these things to shame you, but as my beloved sons, I warn you. He says, I'm writing these things because I love you. Because you're my sons. Because we share this spiritual relationship. I converted you. I have an interest in your life, and I have an interest in what happens to you, and so I've written these things. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm trying to warn you because I love you. When Nathan came in to David and presented that to David, Nathan wasn't trying to embarrass David. Although there is a certain shame associated with sin, and there's a certain shame that ought to be felt and can be conveyed. That's not what Nathan's primary purpose was, though. His purpose was that he loved David and he wanted David to make the changes so that David could be saved. Colossians 1 and verse 28. Colossians 1 and verse 28. Another passage that expresses this warning and how it manifests love. Colossians 1 and verse 28, whom we preach, warning every man and teaching every man in all wisdom, that we may present every man perfect in Christ Jesus. We preach, we warn every man, we do that, that they might be perfect, that they might be complete, that they might be ready for Judgment Day. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 14. We could go on and on, but we want to notice just a couple. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 14. Now we exhort you, brethren, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient toward all men. This is what love demands. And one of the demands of love is that we give warning. Now we want to talk about how the brethren that Jude was writing to, how they manifested their love. We've seen how Jude manifested his. Now let's talk about how they manifested theirs. If you'll go down in the context and take a look at verse 22, it says, and of some have compassion, making a difference. They manifested their love by the compassion that they demonstrated and the difference that they made through that compassion. They manifested their love by what they did. 1 John chapter 3 makes this very, very clear. In fact, John paints it in such a way that you can't misunderstand it. He says in 1 John 3 and verse 16, hereby perceive we the love of God because He laid in His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. He said this is how God's love was made known, by what He did. And we ought to make our love known by what we do, willing to sacrifice for the brethren. It says in verse 17, but whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and sheddeth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? Here's a person who says that he has love, but he doesn't manifest that love. Well, Jude was praising the brethren because they had manifested that love. Verse 18 of 1 John 3, my little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. In other words, don't just call another person beloved, but manifest that love to them. Show them that they are beloved. Show them that you love them by what you do. You remember the parable that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. And the question was, who is my neighbor? And Jesus told this story to illustrate who our neighbor is and what true love is. The first two men, did they really love this man who had been robbed? Oh, they didn't rob him. They were the ones that afflicted him in this way. And so they weren't as bad as other men were. But did they love him? No, they didn't love him because they passed by on the other side. They didn't offer him the help that he needed. It was the Samaritan that loved him. It was the Samaritan that manifested love toward him. Isn't it interesting that the first two men were religious? A priest and a Levite. They were religious people. They were the people who, if anybody manifested love, you would expect they would manifest it. After all, they were taught about the love of God. They should have manifested it. If anybody in the world today manifests love, it ought to be religious people. It ought to be people that claim to know about the love of God. Sometimes religious people are the slowest to manifest love. Sometimes religious people are the most skeptical of all people, the most reserved of all people. But we ought to be manifesting our love. Think about how Jesus manifested His love with lepers, with those that were sick, with those that were morally impure. Think about how Jesus manifested His love toward them. Now there are a lot of religious people that would kind of stand off from people like that. But not Jesus. No, He manifested His love by what He did for them. Those are great opportunities to manifest or make our love known, and Jesus did that. But let's talk about love mutilated. I want to take a look at verse 12 of this. He's speaking of the false teachers. He says, these are spots in your feast of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. Clouds they are without water, carried about of winds. Trees whose fruit withereth, without fruit, twice dead, plucked up by the roots. Now here we read about their feast of charity. This is another way that they manifested their love for one another, is they had special gatherings where they came together and they feasted together. We call them today fellowship meals, but in the first century they were feasts of charity. Love feast. But these were opportunities where the brethren came together to enjoy one another's company and to have a good time together. There wasn't anything wrong with that. Isn't anything wrong with that today. In fact, those things need to be done. They are vital to the health and happiness of a congregation, is that events like that be planned. But what was happening is that these love feasts were being corrupted. They were not worship services. They were just times when Christian people gathered together, and so they were being corrupted. And these false teachers were corrupting them. Now, if you go back to Jude verse 4, Jude verse 4, you'll see what these false teachers were doing. It says, "For there are certain men crept in unawares, who were before of old ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of God into lasciviousness." Here, they take something that's pure and good and they corrupt it. They turn it into lasciviousness. I'll give you an example of this. One of the congregations that I preached for at one time, and it was before I preached there, but nonetheless it was a congregation for which I preached, they had scheduled a special gathering for their young people. They didn't want their young people going to the prom, and so they had a special gathering where the young people could come together and they could get dressed up and they could invite a friend or someone to come with them, and they would have a fancy meal, and they could sit around and listen to music and just talk and do whatever. It was a good idea. Nothing wrong with it in that sense. You know what happened, though, before the night was over? Tables were pushed aside, and here are Christian young people who dance. Nothing wrong with it up to that point. Nothing wrong with young people getting together. Nothing wrong with young people enjoying a nice meal together. Nothing wrong with young people getting dressed up and listening to music. And nothing wrong with any of those things up until that point. But it got corrupted. And what was happening is these love feasts were getting corrupted. They were a good idea. They got the brethren together, and the brethren got to know one another, and their love could increase and grow. But then these individuals began to teach a perverted kind of grace that said, because of the grace of God, we don't have to worry about this, and we don't have to be so uptight about this, and we don't have to be... And before you know it, you have things like alcohol being introduced, or you have things like dancing being introduced, or you have other things that are going on, movies or music or whatever that's going on, that begins to take what is a pure gathering and corrupt it. That's the danger. And that's what was happening here. And they were hidden rocks in the sense that you didn't know they were there. You didn't fully identify them as the problem. And so they posed a danger as you were charting your course. 2 Peter 2 and verse 13 again speaks of how this happened. In 1 Corinthians 11, you remember when Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper, that he talks about how that they had corrupted the Lord's Supper by bringing in a common feast into it. And then these common feasts were also corrupted. Does that mean then that we should not have common feast? Does that mean that we should not have feast of charity, or that we should not have fellowship meals? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that when we have them, we have to govern them. And we have to always be on guard and make sure that they don't become corrupted in some way. That love doesn't get misused. Then we need to take a look at love maintained. And very quickly, the bell's already rung. So look at verse 21. It says, "Keep yourselves in the love of God." They had a responsibility in this. They had to keep themselves in the love of God. Now, sometimes there are religious people who teach that you cannot fall from grace. And they might use certain things even in this chapter to suggest that. For example, in verse 24, "Now unto him that is able to keep you from falling." And then in verse 1, we read of those who are preserved in Jesus Christ. And so they might argue from those passages, see, they're preserved in Jesus Christ. He's able to keep them from falling. And so there's not a possibility of apostasy. But then this verse talks about keeping ourselves in the love of God, that we have a part to play in that. In John chapter 10 and verses 28 and 29, Jesus explained that no man can snatch us out of the Father's hand. No man against our will and the Father's will can cause us to be lost. But we can change our minds. We can take ourselves out of the Father's hand. We can choose not to be in the Father's house. You remember the prodigal son? He chose to leave the Father's house. He chose to go into the far country. We can do that as well. And if we do that, then we lose the love of God. God still loves us, just like the Father still loved the prodigal son. But the prodigal son was no longer in the right place, doing the right thing. And he suffered the consequences of that. That can happen to us. No man can separate us from the love of God, according to Romans chapter 8 and verses 35 through 39. But we can separate ourselves from that love. In John 15 and verses 9 and 10, Jesus explained how we keep ourselves in the love of God. We'll notice this, and the lesson will be yours. But John 15, 9 and 10, notice what Jesus says about how we keep ourselves there. As the Father hath loved me, so I've loved you. Continue ye in my love. It's something we have to continue in. If you keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I've kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So we have to keep the commandments if we want to abide in his love. Just as he kept God's commandments and he was able to abide in God's love, that's how we do it as well. So if we fail to keep those commandments, then we fail to abide in that love. We fail to continue to enjoy the love of God. Thank you.